She found out Dad wasn't her real father and abandoned us until the inheritance came up. I never thought I'd be writing something like this, but I need to get this off my chest. This situation has been haunting me for years, and now things have become even more complicated. 5 years ago, my sister Emily's wedding turned into an absolute disaster, one that tore our family apart. Even now, it's hard to talk about, but to make sense of everything, I need to start from the beginning. I was 28, and Emily was 25. Growing up, we were inseparable, almost like twins, despite the 3-year age gap. We did everything together, shared clothes, had the same group of friends, and could finish each other's sentences. Our mom used to joke that she could never invite just one of us anywhere because we were a buy one, get one free deal. Looking back at those years makes my heart ache a little. We stayed up late on school nights, whispering in the dark about crushes and life plans, sneaking snacks past mom's strict no food in the bedroom rule. We always had each other's backs, covering for one another, whether it was sneaking out to a party or skipping curfew. One of our favorite things to do as kids was to plan our future weddings. Emily was obsessed with a spring wedding, cherry blossoms everywhere, an outdoor ceremony with soft pink petals falling around her. She spent hours showing me pictures of Japanese gardens, dreaming of the perfect day. Meanwhile, I had my heart set on a winter wedding, icicle lights, deep blue and silver decor, and artificial snow making it look like a scene from a fairy tale. We used to joke that we'd have to get married 6 months apart so we could each be the other's maid of honor. So when Emily got engaged to her college sweetheart, Matt, it felt like everything was falling perfectly into place. He was exactly the kind of guy we used to dream about during our late-night talks, kind, funny, and completely devoted to her. When she asked me to be her maid of honor, it wasn't even a question. We spent hours poring over wedding magazines, creating Pinterest boards, and visiting venues. It felt like we were kids playing pretend again, except this time, it was real. Our parents had divorced when we were teenagers, Dad left when I was 16 and Emily was 13. Despite the split, they managed to remain civil for our sake. Mom remarried a few years later to a great guy named Steve, who was kind and supportive without ever trying to replace our dad. Dad, on the other hand, never remarried. He threw himself into his real estate business, working long hours but always making time for us. He used to say, "My daughters are all the family I need." And when Emily got engaged, he was determined to make sure she had the wedding of her dreams. "I want my little girl's wedding to be perfect," he'd say proudly, insisting on covering half the costs. Given how successful his business had become, it wasn't a financial burden, he wanted to do it. Everything seemed to be falling into place. The wedding was just 2 weeks away, and we were finalizing last-minute details. But then, something happened, something that changed everything. 2 weeks before the wedding, everything still seemed perfect. Emily and I were at Mom's house, going through old photo albums for the wedding slideshow. We wanted to include pictures from our childhood, family vacations, birthday parties, the two of us in matching dresses at Easter. We were up in the attic, surrounded by dusty boxes, reminiscing and laughing, when Emily pulled out an old shoebox tied with a faded blue ribbon. Inside were stacks of letters, yellowed with age. At first, we thought they were love letters between Mom and Dad from when they were younger. Emily, always the romantic, giggled as she untied the ribbon and pulled out the top letter. She started reading aloud but stopped mid-sentence. Her face drained of color, and her hands trembled. Confused, I took the letter from her and scanned the words. My stomach dropped. The letters weren't between Mom and Dad. They were from a man named Michael. They were dated around the time Emily was born, and they detailed an affair, Michael's desperate pleas to be part of his child's life. A child that turned out to be Emily. The silence in the attic was suffocating. Emily sat frozen, staring at the letters, her entire world unraveling before her eyes. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "This can't be real." But it was. Emily had always been closer to Dad than I was. While I was the independent one, she was his little shadow, following him around as he worked on home projects, soaking in every bit of knowledge he shared. She had chosen to study business in college because she wanted to take over his real estate company someday. He wasn't just her father, he was her role model, her anchor. And now, in the span of a few moments, she felt like she had lost him. Emily stormed downstairs, letters clutched in her shaking hands. Mom was in the kitchen, unaware of the emotional bomb about to be dropped on her. The moment Mom saw the letters, she paled. Tears welled in her eyes as she collapsed into a chair. She didn't try to deny it. Through sobs, she admitted everything, how she and Michael had a brief affair during a rough patch in her marriage, how she found out she was pregnant and chose to stay with Dad, never telling him the truth. I was scared, she whispered. I didn't want to break our family. Emily wasn't having it. You didn't want to break the family? What do you think you've done now? She shouted. I tried to calm her down, to tell her she needed time to process this, but she wasn't listening. I have to tell Dad, she said. I begged her to wait. The wedding was in 2 weeks, what good would it do to blow everything up now? But Emily wouldn't hear it. How can I walk down the aisle with him knowing my entire life has been a lie, she snapped. How can I let him give a father of the bride speech when he's not even my real father? There was no stopping her. The next day, we drove to Dad's house. He was in his workshop, happily working on a surprise wedding gift for Emily, a handcrafted jewelry box. He smiled when he saw us, but his expression quickly shifted when he noticed Emily's tear-streaked face. What's wrong, sweetheart? Emily handed him the letters. I'll never forget the way his face changed as he read. It was like watching someone's soul leave their body. He sank onto his workbench, gripping the papers in his hands. The unfinished jewelry box sat forgotten beside him. For what felt like an eternity, no one spoke. Then, finally, Dad looked up, his eyes filled with pain, but also something else. Love. Emily, he said softly, biology doesn't make a father. Love does. And I have loved you every single day of your life. Nothing will ever change that. Emily broke down. Dad pulled her into a hug, holding her tightly as she sobbed against his chest. Despite his heartbreak, despite everything, his first instinct was to comfort her. He told her he still wanted to walk her down the aisle. That nothing had changed for him. But for Emily, everything had changed. Overwhelmed, she canceled the wedding. She told Matt she needed time to process everything before she could go through with such a big step in her life. He was understanding, but I could see the pain in his eyes. Everything had unraveled in an instant. And none of us had any idea just how much worse it was going to get. After canceling the wedding, Emily became obsessed with finding Michael, her biological father. It started with late nights scrolling through old online records, trying to piece together any information. Within days, she had tracked him down through social media. I remember the night she showed me his profile, her hands were shaking as she scrolled through pictures of a man who, up until a week ago, had been a stranger. He lived in California, never married, never had any other children. His profile was filled with posts about photography, travel, and a life that seemed carefree. Emily hesitated at first, unsure of how to reach out. But eventually, she sent him a message. He responded almost immediately. Unlike our dad, who had been blindsided by the truth, Michael seemed thrilled to hear from her. He told her he had always wondered about her, that he regretted never being in her life, and that he wanted to make up for lost time. And just like that, everything started changing. At first, Emily kept things quiet. She told herself she was just getting to know him, that she wasn't replacing Dad. But the more she learned about Michael, the more she seemed to pull away from the rest of us. She spent hours on the phone with him, learning about his family history, his hobbies, his life. She discovered they had so much in common, more than she ever did with Dad, or so she convinced herself. She flew out to California to meet him a month later. When she came back, she was different. She raved about how welcoming Michael had been, how she finally felt like she belonged somewhere. She told me about the long talks they had, how he had shown her old family albums, pointed out resemblances between her and relatives she had never known existed. Dad, meanwhile, was struggling. Even though he had told Emily that nothing would ever change, I could see the heartbreak in his eyes whenever she mentioned Michael. It wasn't just that she had found her biological father, it was that she was slowly replacing him. Then came the final blow. One evening, Emily sat Dad and me down and told us she was moving to California. She wanted to be closer to Michael, to start fresh. And, more importantly, she was going to reschedule her wedding, this time, with Michael walking her down the aisle. She hadn't even invited Dad. We didn't find out about the wedding until weeks later when a mutual friend sent me a link to a Facebook album filled with pictures from her big day. There she was, glowing in her white dress, standing beside Michael as he proudly walked her down the aisle. Dad didn't say much when I showed him. He just nodded, forced a smile, and quietly walked out of the room. A week later, without telling her, he transferred the money he had saved for her wedding into her account, along with a note that simply read, "I hope this helps you build the life you want. Love, Dad." Emily never responded. After that, she barely spoke to us. Our conversations dwindled to the occasional text or social media comment. She seemed perfectly happy in California, living a life that no longer included the family she had left behind. And just like that, the sister I had always known, the one who once dreamed of us standing beside each other at our weddings, was gone. A few years passed, and life settled into a routine. I stayed close to Dad, helping him with his real estate business and making sure he wasn't alone. Though he never spoke much about Emily anymore, I could tell he missed her. Every once in a while, I'd catch him looking at old pictures of us as kids, back when we were inseparable. Then, everything changed. It started with small things, misplacing keys, forgetting appointments, but over time, it became clear something was wrong. One afternoon, I found Dad sitting in his truck in our driveway, staring blankly at the dashboard. When I asked him what was wrong, he looked up at me, confused. "I don't remember where I was going," he admitted. That was the moment I knew we had to see a doctor. The diagnosis was devastating, early-onset Alzheimer's. The doctor explained that while medication could slow the progression, we needed to start preparing for the future. And that's exactly what Dad did. A few weeks later, he met with his lawyer and finalized his will. He made me his power of attorney and left everything to me, his house, his business, his savings. "I'm not doing this to punish Emily," he told me when I hesitated. "I'm doing it because you've been the one here. You've taken care of me, and you understand how to handle things. I need to make sure everything is in good hands." I knew he was right, but part of me still felt guilty. No matter what had happened, Emily was still his daughter. Then, out of nowhere, she came back. It started with a text. "Hey, can we talk?" At first, I ignored it. After years of silence, what was there to say? But then the call started. She left voicemail after voicemail, her voice laced with forced warmth, telling me she missed me, that she missed Dad, that she wanted to come home and fix things. I didn't believe a word of it. Then, one afternoon, she showed up at my doorstep. She looked different, thinner, tired, her usually perfect hair unkempt. She barely gave me time to react, before launching into a sob story about how she had made mistakes and how she regretted cutting us off. She said she wanted to be part of the family again, that she realized she had been selfish, and that she wanted to reconnect with Dad before it was too late. It almost sounded believable. Until she brought up the will. "I just don't think it's fair," she said, wiping away a tear. "Dad raised me too. I know I messed up, but I'm still his daughter. He should reconsider, don't you think?" And that's when it all clicked. I had heard rumors that her marriage to James was falling apart. Now, I was seeing the truth. She was desperate. She had no job, no money, and, most telling of all, her so-called real father, Michael, had completely cut her off. I wanted to feel bad for her. But all I could think about was the way she had left. The way she had hurt Dad. And now, after years of silence, she expected to walk back into our lives because she needed money? I took a deep breath and looked her in the eye. "You're only here because you found out about the will, aren't you?" Emily's face twisted with anger. "That's not true. I just want to make things right." "No, you want Dad's money." She let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head. "You've always been his favorite," she spat. "Ever since I found out the truth, you've been poisoning him against me, making sure you get everything." I could feel my hands trembling with anger. "No, Emily," I said quietly. "You did that all on your own." For the first time, I saw the mask slip. I saw the desperation in her eyes. She wasn't here for love. She wasn't here for family. She was here for survival. And I wasn't going to let her manipulate Dad ever again. The more I thought about Emily's sudden return, the less it made sense. She wasn't the type to admit her mistakes or come running back unless something had gone very, very wrong. I didn't have to wait long to find out what it was. The next morning, I woke up to an unexpected message on Facebook from Michael, her biological father. At first, I almost ignored it, but something told me to read it. And I'm glad I did. Michael wasn't reaching out to stir up drama. He was reaching out because he was tired of being manipulated. According to him, Emily had been pressuring him for money for months. She had guilt-tripped him about not being there for her childhood, constantly reminding him that he owed her for all the years he missed. She had even tried to convince him to take out a second mortgage on his house to help her with a business opportunity. That's when it all clicked. She and James had fallen into an MLM scam. Michael explained that James had lost his job a year ago, and in desperation, he had gotten involved with one of those predatory multi-level marketing schemes selling health supplements. They had burned through their savings, maxed out their credit cards, and taken out personal loans, all while chasing the illusion of financial freedom. Now they were drowning in over $100,000 of debt. Michael had refused to give them a dime, and when Emily realized she couldn't manipulate him, she had turned her sights back on Dad. I felt sick reading his message. Emily wasn't back to reconnect. She was back because she had run out of options. Later that afternoon, she showed up at my house again, this time with James by her side. They both looked tense, but Emily plastered on that fake sweet smile she always used when she was trying to get her way. "We just wanted to talk," she said. I let them in, but didn't say a word. I just sat down, pulled out my phone, and started reading Michael's message out loud. The change in her expression was immediate. She went from pretending to be the loving, regretful sister to full-blown panic. James shifted uncomfortably next to her, like he hadn't known the full extent of what she'd been doing either. Halfway through, he stood up and walked out. Emily's eyes followed him, then darted back to me. I could see the moment she realized the game was up. Her shoulders slumped, and for the first time in years, I saw something real in her: defeat. She took a deep breath, and then, in a broken voice, she admitted everything. She told me about the debt. About the lies. About how she had been trying to convince Dad to change his will, because she had no way out. I wanted to be furious, but all I felt was exhausted. "Emily," I said finally, "you need to tell Dad the truth." At first, she resisted. She made excuses, saying she didn't want to upset him, that it would be too much for him in his condition. But I wasn't backing down. "You either tell him," I said, "or I will." After a long silence, she agreed. That evening, we went to see Dad together. It was one of his good days, one of the rare ones where he was clear-headed, aware, and fully himself. When Emily sat down in front of him, she hesitated for a long time before finally breaking down. She told him everything. About the debt. About the lies. About how she had abandoned him and regretted it every single day. Dad was silent for a long time. Then, to my shock, he started laughing. "Lizzie," he said, calling her by the childhood nickname he used to give her. "You've always been like this. Making things more complicated than they need to be. Just like your mother." He wasn't angry. He wasn't bitter. He was just relieved. "I never stopped loving you," he said, taking her hand. "I just didn't know if you'd ever come back." Emily sobbed harder. After a long talk, Dad made her an offer. He would help pay off her debt, not as a gift, but as a loan with conditions. She and James would have to move back home, find real jobs, and go to financial counseling. No more scams, no more get-rich-quick schemes. If she wanted to be part of this family again, she had to earn it. For the first time in a long time, I saw real gratitude in her face. She nodded. "Okay," she whispered. "I'll do it." Maybe, just maybe, my sister was finally ready to change. Emily and James followed through with their promise. Within a month, they packed up their lives in California and moved back to our hometown. Their new reality looked very different from the life they had once boasted about. Gone were the sunny beaches, the expensive brunches, and the entrepreneur lifestyle they had flaunted on social media. Now, they were living in a modest one-bedroom apartment about 10 minutes from Dad's house. It wasn't glamorous, but it was a fresh start. And this time, Emily was doing things the right way. She applied for real jobs, actual, stable employment, instead of chasing the next big financial scheme. Eventually, she landed a position as an office manager at a medical practice. It wasn't her dream job, but it paid well, and for the first time in years, she had a steady paycheck. James also found work at a local tech company. Surprisingly, once he wasn't caught up in get-rich-quick scams, he turned out to be really good with computers. It made me wonder how different things could have been if they had just chosen this path from the beginning. But the biggest change wasn't in their finances. It was in Emily's relationship with Dad. At first, things were awkward. Dad wasn't one to hold grudges, but that didn't mean the years of distance could be erased overnight. Emily had missed birthdays, holidays, and countless small moments that we could never get back. But she tried. Every Monday, Wednesday, and Saturday morning, she would show up at Dad's house to help with his care. She'd sit with him during his good days, talking about old memories, and on his bad days, she'd go along with whatever time period he thought he was in, never correcting him, just making him feel safe. It wasn't easy, but it mattered. One day, I walked into the house and found her sitting beside Dad on the couch, holding his hand. He was telling a story about a fishing trip from when we were kids, except, in his mind, Emily had never left. She had never chosen Michael, never abandoned him. When I looked at her face, I realized she wasn't correcting him. She was just listening. Later, I found her crying in the kitchen. "I spent so much time trying to find what I was missing," she whispered. "And the whole time, I was running away from the one person who was always there." As for Michael, their relationship changed too. After everything came out, the money schemes, the manipulation, Michael distanced himself for a while. But over time, they worked out a neutral relationship. They'd meet for coffee once a month, talk about light-hearted things, but they no longer discussed money or obligations. He stopped introducing her as his long-lost daughter and just called her Emily. That, honestly, felt healthier for both of them. And the inheritance? It stayed exactly as Dad had written it. The bulk of the estate, his house, business holdings, and savings, still went to me, because I was the one who had been by his side. But he also kept the education trust for Emily's future kids. If she has children someday, he told me, they shouldn't suffer because of their parents' mistakes. Emily didn't fight it. For the first time, she didn't argue about what was fair. She accepted the consequences of her choices, and for the first time in a long time, I actually believed her when she said she was grateful. It wasn't a perfect ending. Dad's condition was still progressing. Some days he forgot which of us was which. Other days, he thought we were still teenagers. Emily and I still had years of trust to rebuild. But we were trying. And after everything that had happened, that was more than I ever thought possible. Rebuilding trust wasn't something that happened overnight. It wasn't some movie-like moment where everything suddenly became perfect. But it was happening. Emily and I started spending more time together, not just for Dad's sake, but because, for the first time in years, we both wanted to. At first, it was just about coordinating Dad's care, making sure one of us was always available to check in on him. Then, it became Sunday coffee runs, where we'd sit in the corner of a cafe and talk about things that had nothing to do with the past. One day, Emily pulled out her phone and showed me old photos she had saved, pictures of us as kids, of sleepovers, of family trips, of birthdays. "I don't want to lose this again," she admitted. I didn't say anything. I just reached over and squeezed her hand. Dad's condition continued to decline, as we knew it would. Some days, he was sharp and present, reminiscing about old memories with perfect clarity. Other days, he'd get confused, forgetting where he was or mistaking us for someone else. But there was one thing that never changed: he was happier when we were both there. Emily no longer hesitated before holding his hand. She no longer avoided the difficult moments or tried to pretend like everything was fine. Instead, she showed up. That meant everything. One afternoon, while sitting on the porch with Dad, Emily turned to me and said, "I used to think love was something you could prove, with money, with inheritance, with what someone was willing to give you. But I was wrong. The only thing that really matters is whether they stay." She finally understood. Michael had given her a name, but Dad had given her a lifetime. And in the end, that was what truly made him her father. It took years, but we all learned something from this. That family isn't just blood. It's the people who choose to be there, even when things fall apart. It's the ones who don't leave when the truth gets messy, when things aren't easy, when the world doesn't hand them exactly what they expected. It's about showing up, even when it hurts. And as I sat beside my sister, watching her laugh with Dad on one of his good days, I realized something. Even after all the betrayals, after all the heartbreak, after all the lost years, we had finally found our way back to being a family.